Picture the time of the monasteries in the Middle Ages. People were poor and focused on their survival. Knowledge was confined within the monastery walls, but the walls were not closed. Hospitality, comfort, and medical insight lived there as well.
Hospice did not mean in the 11th century what it means today. It wasn't a place to go to die. Hospice comes out of that same English word that we have for hospitality. It was a place of welcoming. It was a place where most of the monasteries had a B&B. There were no motels or restaurants available in those days, where when you were traveling you could stop and get 3 squares and a roof over your head. And of course people sometimes got sick, as people do when they travel. And some people, when they got very sick, also were tended to in their final illness in those hospices as well. And in those monastic infirmaries, which became the kind of laboratory for observing death and dying, and I think that's the part of the Ars Moriendi that I most came to appreciate. They were curious about patterns, similarities, what worked, what didn't work, not just at a medicinal level, but at that emotional and spiritual level. They began to collect records and stories and find in those patterns opportunities for different kinds of remedies or prescriptions. It's interesting that in those infirmaries, that prescriptive medicine that I mentioned earlier takes on an amazing array of colorful tools and practices. For example, in Switzerland, the monks in the springtime who tended to the infirmaries would go down to Italy and bring back these large Italian lemons and squeeze those lemons and put that juice in the permanent snowfields of the Swiss Alps so that they had lemon juice, citrus, available for the patients in the infirmaries year-round. Now, why would you do that in the 11th century? Well, they did that because they noticed that medicinally, when you had lost your sense of taste because you weren't feeling good, the smell and taste of citrus seemed to bring a kind of comfort to the patient. So talk about an amazing kind of simple technique that included aromatherapy, we would say today, and just good comfort care. Whatever it took, they were willing to provide in these infirmaries. They would also use the wonderful practice of music therapy. The infirmaries were often built next to the chapels, so they shared a common wall. And 7 times a day, the monks were coming to pray the psalms in their chapel services. And the vibration from that chant would be felt on the infirmary side in the bed of the patient. And the monk on duty, the nurse or the doctor on duty, might notice that a certain chant or melody or mode of music, the word mode also comes from the word for mood, would match the mood of the patient and would bring comfort or would bring something up for the patient to struggle with. So it became this wonderful village where it was everything that mattered. The smell, the food, the sounds, the environment, all of that converged so that it wasn't going to an antiseptic facility where you were cut off from life. You were, in fact, in the very heart of life. I think one of the last pieces of this story to understand where the Ars Moriendi came from is related to a little town in France called Cluny. And the monastery there in the 11th century was a powerhouse. It was probably the largest monastery built in Western Europe in all of history. But it wasn't just that monastery and its infirmary that practiced this art of living and dying. What began to happen in the 11th century is because of the success of that monastery, they began in a way to franchise that monastery all over Europe, so that within a short period of time you had hundreds of monasteries in the Benedictine Cluniac tradition that were also using these chants and these prescriptive medications and studying and collecting their own data and their own stories in different parts of Europe in terms of what helped people and what didn't help people who were sick and suffering and dying. So I guess the piece for us that's worth considering is that they knew, our ancestors knew 1,000 years ago, that physical pain, physical suffering can always be alleviated. And we know that today more than ever. So if that's true, why not put as much, if not more, emphasis, especially for a person who is in a place of real suffering, extreme suffering, total pain, as Cecily Saunders called it? Why not address that inner suffering? And they believed that when you did, transformation was always possible. That out of this place of darkness and struggle and hopelessness came an opportunity for not just something that was life-giving for the patient, but also was an experience of life for all of those who got to witness and really were privileged to attend to that person's suffering.
Now, let's move back even further in time to the ancient Celtic lands before the influence of the Roman Empire.
Maybe of all of the traditions and influences that impacted the Ars Moriendi, the tradition of the Celts is the most interesting to my studies and to the work of Sacred Art of Living. It seems as though for centuries before the 11th century, there had already been a well-established tradition of dealing with illness and suffering and companionship and medicine and spirituality from the Celtic lands. And there's quite a long history and tradition to how the Celts that came out of the heartland of Europe ended up in Ireland and Scotland and modern-day England. But there's also a pre-Celtic tradition that goes back to Druid and ancient Aboriginal times that seems to be the seedbed of this tradition. We know, for example, today that the stone henges that are so famous in England and the stone circles in Ireland were actually hospitals, hospices. People would bring their sick and dying relatives to those places, and what the significance of all of those are just beginning to be understood today. But then there's this interesting period of time around the 4th, 5th century, just before the Roman influence starts to really come into the Celtic lands, when you have this interesting burst of energy around a tradition that today we often use the name Anam Cara in association with. Anam Cara is a Gaelic term that means soul friend. And these Anam Cara, these soul friends, lived in communities called Caeli Day, and there was a whole practice and tradition behind how they supported people also, not just at the end of life, but throughout all of the stages of living and dying. And some of those Celts came as visiting teachers and philosophers and missionaries to Europe and brought some of that tradition with them. We know, for example, in the 9th century, John Scotus Erigenia was actually hired by Charlemagne, the head of the Roman Empire, to be a tutor for his grandson in the court. So the Celtic influence was already beginning to take shape and shows up in university life, shows up in the intellectual, and in the scientific and medical life and spiritual life of Europe as well. And it's that connection that we're starting to uncover little by little. And the more we begin to see the interesting connections, the more we understand that some of what the monks were doing on the mainland of Europe, they probably never would have come to themselves out of a Western Greco-Roman perspective. But that this non-dual approach was to a certain extent fed and influenced by the Celtic approach.